Growing up, I lived in an old house. It was one of those places people would describe as having character. Creaky wooden floors, drafty windows, and a sense of age that seemed to settle into your bones. But to me, it was just home. I never thought anything about it was odd. I used to sleep with my hands sticking out from under the covers, a habit I didn't even realize I had. And sometimes when I woke up, there'd be something in my hand, a small trinket. I never questioned it. I'd find little things like an old bottle cap, a smooth stone, or a dried flower. Once, I even woke up with my mother's ring, which she swore she'd lost years ago. I thought it was funny, like the house had a way of giving me gifts. I didn't tell anyone because it didn't feel strange to me at the time. I just put the items on my dresser, arranging them like a little collection. They were just harmless little tokens, something the house was sharing with me. I actually liked the idea of it, like I was part of something secret, like I had a little secret friend. Then, one day, I threw one of the items away. It was a crumpled, rusted bottle cap, not like the others. It was ugly and sharp around the edges. I didn't want it on my dresser with the rest, so I tossed it in the trash, not thinking anything of it. And that's when things started to change. After that, the items became different. Not the quirky little objects I was used to. They started to feel wrong, sinister even. The next night, I woke up with something cold and metallic in my grip. My heart pounded as I sat up, and when I opened my hand, I nearly screamed. A small, serrated knife lay across my palm, the blade sharp and glinting in the faint moonlight that seeped through my bedroom window. It was too big to be a kitchen knife, and too dull to be new, but the edges were worn, and the handle was cracked and stained. I had no idea where it had come from, but the sight of it made me scared. I threw the knife across the room in a panic, hearing it clatter onto the floor, and pulled my hand close to my chest. My fingers tingled like they'd been holding the thing for hours, gripping it tightly in my sleep. I didn't tell anyone about it. What would I even say? That the house was giving me gifts? But it didn't stop. Each night after that, the objects grew more disturbing. A shard of glass, still speckled with dirt, an old razor blade with spots of rust, and once something that looked like an animal's tooth, jagged and yellow. I started waking up in a cold sweat, terrified to look at what I'd find clutched in my hand next. The worst night, though, was when I woke up feeling the weight of something heavier than ever before. My hand was clenched around something cold and stiff. As I slowly opened my fingers, dread washed over me. There in my palm was a small, withered hand. It looked human, but it wasn't. I think it was a raccoon's hand. The skin was shriveled, grayish, the nails black and cracked. It didn't seem like it had belonged to a body in a long time, yet there it was, lifeless and heavy in my hand. I remember staring at it, paralyzed with fear in the near dark, as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. I never told my parents the full story, but I asked to switch rooms and for years slept on the couch in the basement. All they knew was that I couldn't stand sleeping in that room any longer. From then on, I slept with my hands tucked under the covers no matter how hot I got. I kept the basement light on until I left for college. I don't know what had started giving me those things, or why, but I never slept with my hand outstretched again. Even now, years later, I can't stop thinking about that last gift. The sensation of that cold, decayed hand still haunts me. And I wonder, what would have happened if I hadn't thrown that broken, rusted bottle cap in the trash? Hurricane season wasn't anything new. I'd lived my entire life in this corner of rural Florida, where the marshes meet the grazing fields, and I'd ridden out plenty of storms. When you're a cattle farmer, there's no picking up and leaving when big ones roll in. You've got to stay. You've got to keep the animals safe and the property secure. This storm, though, the warnings had been dire. A Category 4 monster churning its way up the coast, promising howling winds and pouring rain. Most of the nearby farmers had packed up and headed inland, leaving their pastures empty. But I couldn't bring myself to go. I had a herd of nearly 60 head out in that field, and I couldn't just abandon them, so I hunkered down. The first few hours of the storm passed in a blur of rain and wind that rattled every window and door in my old farmhouse. The power went out just after midnight, leaving me in the dark, with nothing but the hum of a battery-powered radio for company. I kept checking on the cows through the living room window, using a flashlight to catch their pale forms huddled together in the far pasture. I knew they'd be restless and scared, but as long as those fences held, they'd be fine. Around 2 a.m., the wind shifted. It came screaming in from the north, fierce enough that I heard the barn doors slamming open and shut, echoing like gunshots through the howling gale. If the barn blew apart, the cows would scatter, and in this kind of weather, I'd never get 'em back. Grabbing my slicker and boots, I headed out into the storm, flashlight in hand. The rain stung like needles against my face, and the wind was so strong it nearly bowled me over as I crossed the yard to the barn. My flashlight flickered erratically, but I kept my eyes on the path, moving carefully through the mud. When I reached the barn, the door was swinging wildly on its hinges, wood splintering with each impact. I shoved it shut and dropped the metal latch, securing it. My heart was pounding, but the cows inside seemed calm enough, only the whites of their eyes visible in the dim light. I glanced out toward the pasture. The herd was still there, clustered in a tight knot, and I could see their dark shapes moving restlessly through the curtains of rain, their lowing calls echoing in the darkness. That alone wasn't too strange. Storms always got them agitated. But this was different. They weren't just calling. They were panicking. My flashlight beam cut through the rain, casting long, shifting shadows as I approached the fence. I shined the light into the pasture, hoping to see the cattle, but most of them had gathered at the far end of the field and were pressed together in a tight, frantic mass. Lightning flashed, and for a second everything was illuminated in a ghostly white. That's when I saw it. At first I thought it was just a log, an enormous dark shape near the edge of the fence line, half hidden in the tall grass. But then it moved, and my heart nearly stopped. It slithered forward, long and impossibly low to the ground, moving with a slow, terrifying purpose. In the brief flare of light, I caught a glimpse of its massive body. Thick, armored scales glistening in the rain, its head large and triangular, with glowing eyes that seemed to reflect the storm itself. A crocodile. Not just any croc, though. This thing was massive, easily over 20 feet long. It dwarfed the fence beside it, the size of an ancient beast out of some forgotten age. I'd heard rumors. Stories whispered in town about crocodiles mixing with the gator population in the swamps, but I'd never believed it. Not really. Crocs weren't supposed to be here, and certainly not something this monstrous. But there it was, looming in the storm, hunting. My flashlight trembled as I raised it again, catching the beast just as it slithered closer to the cattle. Its powerful jaws opened slightly, revealing a row of jagged teeth that looked like rusted knives. It moved with deadly patience, almost like it knew the cattle had nowhere to go. I couldn't breathe. I should have run, should have shouted, should have done something, but I was frozen, just rooted to that spot in the rain. The croc didn't see me, not yet. It was focused on its prey. Suddenly, a gust of wind rattled the barn doors behind me again, slamming them open with a thunderous bang. The noise jolted me out of my shock, and my light wavered wildly. The croc's head jerked towards me, its eyes locking onto mine. I could feel its gaze, heavy, ancient, and cold. The storm raged around us, but everything else went still. It didn't move, but I could sense the hunger in it, the primal need to hunt. I took a step forward, and I stumbled back, my boots slipping in the mud. I didn't wait to see what it would do next. I staggered to my feet and ran for the house, my flashlight swinging wildly in my hand. I banged the door open as I burst inside, slamming it shut behind me. I leaned against it, chest heaving, listening, hoping the door would hold if it chased me. But there was only the sound of the wind and the rain. A few minutes later, the wretched sound of a cow screaming cut through the storm, and I knew what had happened. Looking through the window was hopeless now. The rain was sideways, and the wind whipped leaves and branches with a relentless fury. As the storm raged through the night, I heard nothing else, just the wind and the rain. I locked every door, every window. I didn't dare look outside again. I just sat there, shaking, waiting for morning. I kept imagining those glowing eyes, that massive body lurking just outside in this storm, waiting. The hours dragged on, and when the hurricane finally passed, the morning sun broke through the clouds, casting everything in an eerie calm. The fence near the far pasture was torn apart. The thick wooden beams splintered like twigs. The cows had scattered, some laying down, others still pacing nervously, but the creature was gone. There were deep gouges carved into the muddy ground leading toward the swamp at the edge of my property. When I did my head count, I was missing 2 cows. It wasn't just the storm that had come through last night. The beast had been real. As I stood there in the silence of the aftermath, I realized the rumors weren't just stories. There was a crocodile in these swamps, and it was bigger, smarter, and more dangerous than anything I'd ever seen. The storm must have brought it in from the marshes, a night dark enough to make it come close. It was a twisted thing that shouldn't exist, and it's still out there. When I first moved into the apartment, I couldn't have been more excited. It was bright, modern, and situated in a great neighborhood, the perfect place to settle down. I'd finally found somewhere I could call home, a place where my 2 dogs, Max and Luna, could stretch out and be happy. But it didn't take long for things to feel off. Every morning when I came back from my overnight shifts, I'd find Max and Luna sprawled out on the floor, exhausted. It wasn't the normal we've been sleeping all night tired. This was something different, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. They were on edge, irritable, with their sides heaving like they'd been running marathons all night. And when I greeted them, they seemed almost relieved, like I'd returned just in time to save them from something. I chalked it up to them adjusting to the new place, thinking maybe they were just anxious or stressed from the move. But when their once playful personalities seemed to dull, I knew I needed to figure out what was going on. So I bought a home security camera, one of those small cameras you can tuck onto a bookshelf and log into, the kind you can view live from your phone. It was meant to just give me peace of mind, to show me that everything was normal while I was away at work. That first night, I set it up in the living room, pointed toward the hallway that led to my bedroom. I left the dogs with their usual toys and made sure they had fresh water before I left. My phone stayed silent during the first few hours of my shift, and I started to relax. But then, at exactly 1:30 a.m., I got an alert. Motion detected. Curious, I opened the app and stared at the live feed. Max and Luna were in the hallway, fur bristling, their ears pinned all the way back. Their eyes were locked on the bedroom door, which I knew I'd left shut. But now it was open, just a crack. They stared at it, growling low and deep in their throats. And then they lunged. Both dogs exploded into a frenzy, barking and snapping at the empty space just inside the doorway. But as hard as I looked, I couldn't see anything. There was nobody there, no shadow, no figure, just the dogs freaking out like they were going after some invisible intruder. Shocked, I watched as they slowly backed away, eyes still locked on whatever it was they were seeing, and they began to track it, whatever it was, down the hallway with their teeth bared, snarling and growling until they reached the living room. Then, after a couple of moments of stillness, they both slumped to the floor, panting hard. I was glued to the screen, waiting, but nothing else happened. The same thing occurred the next night, and the night after that. Each time it was at exactly 1:30 a.m. The bedroom door would creak open just an inch. The dogs would go wild, barking and lunging at something I couldn't see, and then they'd follow it down the hallway before collapsing the living room, just utterly drained. I knew I couldn't keep watching this play out from the same angle. Whatever was happening, it seemed to start in the bedroom, so I moved the camera to the end of the hallway and pointed it directly at my bedroom door. The next night, I sat at work with my phone in my hand, fingers trembling. I knew the alert was coming, but somehow knowing made it worse. At 1:30 a.m., on the dot, the alert came through. With a deep breath, I opened the app and watched as the door to my bedroom slowly, almost delicately swung open. My jaw dropped. This time I had a perfect view, and it was clearer than ever that nothing was there. But Max and Luna saw something. They charged the doorway, barking furiously, and then the door moved again. It didn't just swing wider, it slammed open, bouncing off the wall with a force that made my heart leap into my throat. The dogs recoiled, yelping, but then they began tracking whatever it was down the hallway, silently. This time, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. As they moved, their heads turned in unison, following a path that led straight to the balcony door. My stomach twisted. I always kept that door locked. But on the feed, I saw the handle jiggle. My dogs lunged at the glass, barking maniacally, and I watched in horror as the door began to inch open. The sound it made, metal scraping against metal, echoed through the app speakers, setting my teeth on edge. I couldn't take it anymore. I called in sick and rushed home. When I burst through the front door, the dogs greeted me as usual, wagging their tails weakly before collapsing in a heap on the floor. I went straight to the balcony door, and it was shut tight, locked, just as I'd left it. But that didn't explain what I'd seen on the camera. I didn't know what to think, what to believe. In desperation, I knocked on my neighbor's door the next morning. I didn't care if she thought I was crazy. I needed answers, and I'm sure my dog's barking was waking her up at night, too. My neighbor was a 40-something woman who had been friendly with me from the start. She always waved to me when I saw her around the building. She listened quietly as I told her what had been happening, and I half expected her to laugh it off, but instead, her eyes got huge and her face went pale. "You didn't know?" she whispered. "Know what?" I asked, dread coiling tight in my stomach. "The last person who lived in your unit, he was a young man, lived alone. He didn't make it. Someone broke in and robbed him." He what?" "They found him in the bedroom. I guess there'd been a struggle in the middle of the night, and whoever did it got away through the balcony." I stared at her, my mind reeling. The balcony door. The dogs, the strange, empty presence that moved through the apartment in the middle of the night at 1:30 a.m. every night. "It happens every night, like on a loop," I whispered more to myself than to my neighbor. She looked sad. "I guess so." That night, I took the dogs and moved in with my sister, and I haven't been back since. Sometimes I wonder if I didn't work nights, would I have heard the sound of metal scraping against metal, the sound of a balcony door creaking open? And I wonder if I hadn't moved out, what would I have seen standing there on that dark, empty balcony at 1:30 a.m.? I always liked to get to the studio early, before the world woke up, before the streetlights clicked off and the commuters clogged the roads with their frantic forward motion. There was something about those early hours, quiet, still, almost sacred, that made my mind clearer. It was just me and the canvas, the way it should be. The studio itself was nothing special, just a rented space in an old building downtown near work, sandwiched between a shuttered flower shop and a cafe that hadn't opened yet. But I liked the creaky floorboards, the way the light poured in through the large, grimy windows filtered through the dust that seemed to hang suspended in the air. I could lose hours in that room, the outside world just falling away as soon as the door shut behind me. It was an old building, and like all old buildings, it had its stories. I'd heard some of them from other artists, mostly vague murmurs about the place being haunted, but I'd laughed it off at the time. Haunted? That's what people said about any building that creaked and groaned with age. No, I didn't believe in ghosts. I believed in brushstrokes and creation, nothing else. But it didn't take long before I started to feel it. At first, it was just a small thing, a weight in the air like the room was more full than it should be. It wasn't every time I came in, but on certain days, I'd unlock the door, step inside, and feel goosebumps on my arms like someone was there watching me. I'd walk the studio, but of course the room was empty. It was just me and my easels, like always. I told myself it was nothing, a trick of the mind maybe, overwork, but on those particular days the feeling stayed with me. One evening after work, as I was setting up to paint, I caught the faint scent of something familiar. It was warm and faintly sweet, like the smell of old books or dried flowers. It hung in the air just for a moment, and then it was gone. I paused, with my brush in my hand, scanning the room. There was no reason for that smell. No old books, no flowers, just turpentine, paint, and canvas. I put it out of my head. But then there was the shadow. It was subtle at first. When the sun was up, I had my back to the windows so I could use the natural light on the canvas. The shadow would break the light behind me as it passed between me and the window, what had to be just inches from me. Other times, it was almost like a smudge at the edge of my vision. I'd be working, focused on the canvas, and I'd catch a glimpse of it in the corner of the room. A flicker, like someone passing by, just out of view. And when I'd turn to look, there was nothing there. I tried to ignore it. I told myself it was nothing. I'd been working long hours after all, burning the candle at both ends. It was probably just my tired brain playing tricks on me. But it felt real. It wasn't frightening, though, not at first. More like companionship, something that shared the space with me. I started to wonder if maybe the stories were true. Maybe the studio was haunted, but by something benign. Maybe it was the spirit of another artist, someone long gone who still lingered here in this old building, watching us work. I didn't mind the idea, really. It was kind of comforting in a strange way. But then things started to escalate. One night, well past midnight, I was packing up to leave when I felt it again, that heavy presence, but this time much closer. The air felt thick, charged with something I couldn't name. As I turned to grab my coat, I saw the shadow again, but it was more well-defined. It was there, standing on the other side of my easel, a dark shape just barely visible in the dim light. I froze. The shape didn't move either, but it was definitely watching me. I couldn't explain how I knew, but I could feel it. I slowly backed toward the door. The room was dead silent except for the creaking of the floorboards under my own feet. My hand fumbled for the light switch, and when I flicked it off, I heard it. A soft sigh, almost imperceptible, like the release of a held breath. I bolted out of the studio, slamming the door behind me. I didn't go back for a couple of days. I needed time to process what had happened. Had I really seen something? Or had my mind finally cracked from the exhaustion? I honestly wasn't sure anymore. When I finally did return, I could feel it was still there, but it had changed. It was more interactive. I still don't know what it is. A ghost? A being from another time, another life? I'll never know for sure. But I keep going back to the studio because despite the unease, despite the tension, I can't stay away. It's like it wants me in that creative space and has become part of my creative process. My art has become darker. And maybe that's the scariest part, because while I can leave the studio anytime I want, I'm starting to wonder if the shadow is following me home. I'd convinced myself that it existed only in the studio. Whatever was in that space, it belonged there. Once I locked the door behind me at night, I could leave it all behind. But that changed one evening after I'd finished a piece I'd been working on for weeks. I packed up my stuff and turned out the lights like always. The shadow had been quieter recently. I'd felt it less, almost as if it had been satisfied just watching me paint. I didn't feel its presence as strongly, and I thought maybe it had moved on. The walk home was quiet, the streets empty except for the occasional car going by. I felt relieved in the crisp night air, as if I'd shed something heavy the moment I had left that building. When I reached my apartment, I unlocked the door, greeted my dog, who was always waiting anxiously by the door, and collapsed on the couch. It wasn't until later, that I'd showered and settled into bed, that I noticed something odd. That smell. It was that same warm, sweet old book scent that I'd caught in the studio weeks before. It was faint, but unmistakable. It clung to the air in my bedroom as if it had been there for hours, undisturbed. I sat up in bed looking for anything out of place, and at first everything looked normal. The faint light from the street outside gave me just enough light to see that my dog was curled up at the foot of the bed, calm. But there was that heaviness in the air, that familiar sense of being watched that I had only felt at the studio. I glanced toward the far corner of the room, the darkest spot where the light barely reached, and that's when I saw it. A dark spot on the wall in the shadows by the door. A smudge, really. I wanted to look away, but my eyes were locked on that stain on the wall. I grabbed for my phone on the nightstand, my hands trembling as I fumbled to turn on the flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the wall. There was a handprint, small and dripping black like ink. I let out a shaky breath, not believing my eyes, and then I heard the sound, a soft scampering, like someone moving on all fours across the floor. It came from the living room. I whipped around, my heart pounding, but the room was still. My dog, now awake, had lifted his head, his ears up and his eyes wide. He wasn't barking, but his eyes were fixed on the doorway leading to the living room. Slowly, I got out of bed and made my way toward the door. My hand hovered over the light switch for a moment before I flicked it on. The hallway beyond was empty. I slowly inched my way toward the living room, terrified of what I might see. As I stepped through the doorway, the sweet smell grew stronger, sickening. I felt my chest tighten, and then I saw it. On the floor of the living room near the front door, where the shadows pooled, was something that made my blood run cold. 2 handprints and 2 long footprints grouped together. They were faint, but unmistakable, smudged into the wood floor as if someone had pressed their hands and feet there, dragging slightly from a crouched position. They hadn't been there before, I was sure of it. My heart pounded in my chest as I crouched down to take a closer look. My stomach twisted as I stood up, backing away from the door. My mind raced, trying to find a rational explanation. But deep down, I knew what it meant. The shadow was here. It had followed me home. I remember the day the Google car drove down our street. It was one of those rare, perfect fall afternoons where the sun wasn't too hot, the air felt crisp, and everything seemed strangely peaceful. I saw it out of the corner of my eye as I walked to the mailbox. The unmistakable camera perched on top like some mechanical bird scanning the road. For a second, I thought about waving or making a funny face, but I didn't. Instead, I stood on the sidewalk and watched it roll past, as it recorded every inch of the street. I shrugged it off and went about my day, completely unaware of what Google was about to show me. A few weeks later, on a lazy Sunday afternoon, I decided to check out the street view on Google Maps to see if they'd updated my street. I zoomed in on my neighborhood, recognizing the familiar houses and cars, and spotted myself as a vague blur near the mailbox. I scanned around the street, turning to view my building and the narrow alley that separated my apartment from the neighboring building. I felt a creeping, strange feeling as I stared at the image. I knew something was wrong as I zoomed in, inch by inch. There, half hidden in the shadows of the alley, was a man. At first, he was just a blurry shape tucked behind the garbage bins, almost blending into the wall. But as I zoomed in closer, the image sharpened. He was standing in the shadows, barely visible, but unmistakably there. It was him, my neighbor. I'd seen him countless times, always on his front porch, always with a can of cheap beer in his hand. He never spoke to anyone. He'd just watch, his eyes tracking people like a predator scoping out his prey. He'd never talked to me directly, but every time I passed by, I could feel him silently watching for too long. But now there he was, caught on camera, frozen in a moment in time. He was crouched low against the side of the building, peeking out from behind the trash cans, staring directly at the street, staring directly at me. I stared at the image, trying to process what I was seeing. Why was he hiding there, watching me? I shuddered and closed the Google tab, trying to shake off the creeping dread I was feeling, but I couldn't forget the image. The way he'd been squatting down there, perfectly still, so perfectly hidden, like a spider waiting for its prey to just get a little closer. I tried to convince myself maybe he was just taking a shortcut, or was throwing something away, but that didn't explain why he was hiding. I knew those were just excuses, rationalizations. There was no logical reason for anyone to be lurking in the alley like that. Months passed, and I avoided walking by his house whenever I could. I kept my blinds tightly shut, especially at night, but every time I went outside, I wondered if he was inside just watching. He really made me anxious. And then, about a year later, it happened. It was late on a Tuesday afternoon when I saw the lights through my blinds and peeked outside to see half a dozen cop cars parked haphazardly in front of his house. Officers swarmed the place, and I could hear voices at his front door. I watched from my window as they led him out in handcuffs. His head was bowed, face blank and expressionless as they shoved him into the back of a squad car. He didn't resist, didn't fight, just got in quietly like this was something he'd been expecting all along. The neighborhood buzzed with gossip that night, everyone whispering about what had happened. The story was shocking, horrifying really, but in a strange way, not entirely unexpected. He'd been arrested for selling pictures online. Not just any pictures, though. Pictures of us. His neighbors, the people he'd been silently watching from his porch and his house for years. They'd found thousands of images on his computer, all meticulously labeled and organized. He'd been tracking us, watching us come and go, and taking candid shots through windows, over fences, even from behind the trees. He'd even installed hidden cameras in strategic locations around the block, angled into bedrooms and bathroom windows. The guy was a total creep, connected to other creeps. He had an online pay site where people could watch us. The thought of it made my skin crawl. I felt so violated, exposed. But the worst part came when the police released the full report. My bedroom, my ground floor bedroom that faced the alley, had been one of his primary targets. He'd taken hundreds of photos and video of me, sleeping, changing, just sitting at my desk, completely unaware that I was being watched. They found camera equipment mounted behind the bins in the alley, aimed directly at my window. He'd probably been checking his camera in the alley when the Google Maps car had gone by. I couldn't stay in that apartment after that. I didn't know if his subscriber freaks knew the address or not. I moved out when my lease was up. My new place is on the 3rd floor, and I keep my blinds closed. Now, when I have a nightmare, it's his face I see, his empty, predatory eyes, as he crouched in that alley, watching on that sunny day when the Google car happened to roll by. I wonder how long he'd been doing it, and about the other freaks who are willing to pay to watch strangers. And most terrifying of all, I wonder who else is being watched and streamed like I was without ever knowing it. If you like these stories, this is the place for you. I cover scary stories about ghosts, cryptids, paranormal events, and disturbing, creepy human encounters. My Etsy store is open if you'd like to support me there. The link's in the description. Thanks for watching, and see you next week.